This meeting is now being recorded. All guests have been muted.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our Divar IP 3 and 7000 webinar. Before we get started, I just want to run through some of the basics. The webinar as we're giving it now is being recorded, but all the names, questions, answers, and polls are hidden from the recording, so they won't be seen. At the end of the webinar, we have a poll with 5 questions where we would like to have your input and feedback based on the material given, and if the desire is there, you can provide any suggestions of any additional topics you would like to see in the future. If we just look at some of the basics of the application itself, as soon as I will provide a file for you to download, the Files button will light up and it will make available any files that I'm publishing to you. We have a Q&A button, and that is the one option that should be used to direct any questions to the chat functionality, as it is has been disabled. Therefore, if you have any questions during the webinar itself, please use the Q&A button, and we'll have a dedicated person answering your questions to the best of their ability. Then, of course, we have a black notification bar with any kind of additional information of people joining, leaving, etc. And, of course, the full screen help and leave webinar button. You can simply run it from web-based, as we do not recommend the download the software as we provide it in the help function of the program itself. So, time to get started. Looking at a Divar IP technical training, where we'll be addressing the simple needs of getting a unit out of the box and setting it up from scratch through both the wizard and the configuration client. If we're looking at the table of contents, we have a short system overview where spread out across 2 sessions the equipment that we will be using to demonstrate with. Then we have a second chapter where we're preparing all the devices for configuration to be used inside the configuration wizard of the Divar IP. The third chapter is where we'll be doing a basic system configuration via the wizard, and finally the system configuration, basically an advanced part via the configuration client, where we can configure any additional features that are not covered by the BBMS configuration wizard itself. And this is for our first part. If we're looking at an advanced session that we have that still has to be determined by a date, we'll be looking at remotely setting up a Divar IP to be used over the internet, to use the video security app with a mobile device across a remote connection, and some special input and relay and scripting triggered recording scenarios. And we'll also be showing this with an example of an ADEM module that we support within our software to display this scenario. So if any of these topics you feel that you're missing, please wait for our message about the advanced session in which we will be covering these types of scenarios. Of course, if you feel that there are any additional points being raised that you feel like you would like to see, please inform us at the end of the webinar with the use of the poll, that we can consider including them into our advanced session to try and cover as much of your needs as we can. So, if we look at the basic system overview as we would be using it, it's primarily, of course, in this first topic, we'll be focusing on the local environment, where we have one Divar IP 3000 with several cameras that we will be showing the example with. If we're looking at the standard internet router and the internet connection in combination with the video security app that is, as mentioned, will be covered in our advanced session. Just to give you a brief example of what the products roughly are that we will be using throughout these 2 sessions is a Divar IP 3000, the 4x2 terabyte version, as well as an Autodome 7000 PTZ camera with intelligent video analysis, a Denon IP 7000 HD with motorized back focus and motion plus, and a VIP X1 XF encoder with an analog PTZ camera connected. So if we look at preparing our devices for configuration fresh out of the box, what we have is that by default our cameras are configured in such a way that when they're first connected to a network, they will automatically obtain an IP address through the dynamic host configuration protocol, or DHCP. This of course has a dependency that a DHCP server needs to be active on the site. If this is the case, and you would see that with most standard internet routers this will be set up already, but if it is configured, then you have met all the pre-requirements to start up the wizard and to start with the basic configuration of the system, because the devices will be available to be reached from the Divar IP inside the network itself. Of course, if we are looking at a scenario where there is no DHCP server active on the site, or if you do not wish to use it, our cameras are set up in such a way that after a brief period of time where they're scanning across the network to see if they can obtain a IP address automatically, they would switch to a default IP address, which is set to 192.168.0.1. Of course, this we have to change manually first before we can use these devices inside the BVMS configuration wizard, and we'll be using the BVMS configuration client for this. So this is always an important thing to keep in mind before starting with the wizard. If you have devices in a factory default state, rather than starting with the wizard, you would have to start with the BVMS configuration client. Now if we take a look at how do we reach it from the kiosk mode, it's the icon on the right with the configuration client mentioned under it, and as soon as we start that up, we move into the client, and at the top of the application we have a hardware menu where the first option is the initial device scan. Now upon clicking this option, a pop-up window will be opened, and any device that can be found on the network with the default IP address will then be placed into a list here, and from this point onward we can actually start either one by one changing the IP address or defining a starting and ending range for all devices, and then in a hierarchical fashion from one to the last one, the devices will be assigned an IP address based on the range that you have provided. Now you'll see that any changes that you're making to the devices from this initial device scan will be marked in red. So if you change the IP address of a device and of course enter the subnet mask, you'll see that they're marked in red. As soon as you hit the OK button at the bottom of the pop-up window, you will receive a notification that the devices will be restarted if the IP addresses are changed, and approximately this takes about 20 to 30 seconds after accepting this warning message for the cameras to come back online. As soon as that has happened, then actually we're in a state where we have our cameras ready and we can move directly into the configuration through the wizard. So you see that now we're moving on to the system configuration via the wizard, which the wizard is a basic 10-step process in which we can set up a Divar IP unit to be viewed live and have the recording of the cameras that I'm adding into my configuration at that time. Of course, any advanced type of configuration is what we will have to do through the configuration client that we previously changed the IP addresses in, and this will be addressed after we've set up a basic system through the wizard. So, as mentioned, we have a configuration wizard icon that we simply click, and as soon as we hit this, it will automatically take us into the first step of the wizard, where we have some informational messages as well as an initial license check being performed. You'll see that there's some information there to ensure you that all devices are configured with an IP address onto the network. We need to determine, are our cameras located in a same subnet, or do we need to start adding devices across multiple subnets? and for adding any additional storage devices, with the exception of the internal storage of the Divar IP itself, we need to already start noting the IP addresses of these devices because we would need them at a later stage. Also important to keep in mind that on the right-hand side of the first step, we have a restriction section, and it would be a good idea, based on the type of configuration that you're trying to set up, to read through these restrictions to get an idea, is the wizard suited for whatever configuration I'm trying to set up, and am I actually ready to start progressing through the 10 steps to set up this configuration, or do I need to immediately move into the configuration client? So if I'm running into any scenario which is mentioned as a restriction of the wizard that it would not be capable of performing, then you already know that there is no point in continuing through the wizard process, but you immediately need to move to the configuration client itself. Now, as you'll see at the bottom here, that the wizard, there's a green message which says that the wizard has been initialized successfully and that the license is valid. If we are looking at the scenario that there actually should not be any reason, especially when the unit comes factory default, why this check would fail. But if you ever encounter a rare case where there is a text in red marked that it hasn't passed the license check, the recommendation is always to get in touch with the local Bosch support organization, and from that moment onward they will start troubleshooting to see what actually has happened. But as mentioned, with a factory default device, there shouldn't be any reason why this check would fail, because all the licensing, basic licensing, is pre-installed on the unit. So if we continue into actually setting up the system, we move to Configuration Wizard Step 2. This is the general screen you will always see, because the Divar IP always comes with the same pre-configured IP address, which is a static address. And as you'll see here, that is the 192.168.0.200 with a /24 subnet mask. Now, if you see that any changes made to the static IP address here will result, as soon as you click the next button, in a warning message that the unit has to reboot to fully apply the new IP address to its network interface. And as soon as the unit has finished the rebooting process, it will be online with the IP address that you have entered here. And then you can basically start from step 1, move on to step 2, etc. Again, as long as you have the desired network configuration. Of course, another option that we have is to automatically obtain an IP address via DHCP again. And the same applies here as to changing the static IP address, is that as soon as we mark the checkbox that we would like to have the automatic settings via DHCP, hitting the next button will result in a warning message, and that the Divar IP will have to reboot to apply the settings. And then, of course, upon reboot, the unit comes back up with an automatically assigned IP address, and from that moment onward, we can continue through the wizard. So if we move into step 3, which is a very critical part of the system configuration, is to configure the time settings. Of course, having the correct time and time zone throughout the CCTV system is of the utmost importance, because it can create various amount of issues. So always ensure that you set up the unit for the time zone where you are located in, and then the settings that are provided here, that is also in the end what, in a default configuration, our cameras will be synchronizing their time too. You have two options. The first one would be to adjust the time manually with the use of the drop-down menu for the date and the up and down buttons to move to the time, so in the hours, minutes, and seconds field, as well as the AM or PM setting. Then a final option is to have the Divar IP synchronized to a time server. And this would only apply in cases when you are 100% sure that there is a IP-based time server inside the network, where the Divar IP can retrieve the correct time from. If this is not the case, and this will probably be the case in most common scenarios, that there is no time server present, you can simply leave the time server configuration as default here, where it lists the time.windows.com, which is the default setting any Windows operating system based machine will receive. But yeah, that is where it automatically updates the clock for the daylight savings time, etc. from. But as long as there is no known configuration change there to be made, it can simply be left as default as it is now. So once that has been verified in setting up, we can proceed to step 4. And this is where we need to define the local area connection that we're going to be using to set up our configuration from. Now, by default, you'll see that at the bottom it says please select the network adapter for your local video network. By default, this will have no selection in there, and with use of the drop-down menu, you simply need to select the correct local area connection. In case of the Divar IP 3000, this will only be one connection listed because the device only has one network interface card. If you have a Divar IP 7000, you could have 2 connections listed, and you simply need to select the correct one based on the IP address or the IPv4 address that is listed in brackets behind the local connection itself. And as soon as you have selected the correct network interface card, you will see that above the network adapter selection there will be a green message stating that the video recording manager service is found and is running. And as soon as this is displayed in green, we have met the requirements to continue the next step. If any of the requirements here are not met, we will not be able to click the next button on this step of the wizard. You'll see here as well that we have an option to import the configuration of either a backup made of a previous configuration or from a different Divar IP unit that has been already configured, and you simply want to use an identical configuration template for this unit. We will address how to perform these exact steps at the finalization of the wizard at the end, so that we will get back on. And then for now we can move on to the device selection step 5. So basically what happens here is that you'll see as soon as you continue to step 5, there'll be a period of time for which the wizard will be scanning for any kind of device listed on the network. So if you have only 2 or 3 cameras connected in the network, those will be the only ones that will be being displayed. But you have to keep in mind that if there is a mixture of systems online, so an excess of cameras, you'll have to select each device individually or with the selection of all, which ones you would like to add into your system. And you'll see this that within the include column there'll be a green check mark indicating that this is a device you would like to include inside your configuration. By default, the scanning range of the wizard is set to the local subnet only, which in most cases will be the recommended setting to use. But if you encounter a situation where there are different subnets present on the physical site and we need to add cameras from different subnets, then we can change the range of the network scan to the complete accessible network as defined on the network equipment itself, and we can perform a rescan of the network. Below this, you'll see that the license status is marked also with a green check mark. If you get into a scenario where you would select all the devices that your network is able to scan, and you would, with doing this, you would exceed the license limits of what has been installed on the Divar IP, you would see that there will be, instead of a green check mark, there will be a table format listed, how many devices and what device type they are you have selected that exceed the license capabilities. So as you'll see on a Divar IP 3000, we have a support for 32 camera channels. In the case that I would select 35 cameras, for example, I would see in my license status a summary that says that I have selected 3 devices that more than my license allows me to, and it will also then not allow me to continue into the next step of the wizard. So then you have to perform a corrective action to remove the excess cameras from the selection list, and as soon as that has been corrected, you'll notice that the license status should change to a green check mark again, and it will allow you to continue to the next step of the configuration wizard. So that is what we will do. Now moving on to step 6 for the device authentication. Based on the devices selected in our list, the wizard will start preparing the devices list for authentication and will start connecting to the server. Now in most cases, if you have a new site that you're installing, you'll see that the table to enter the authentication for devices is empty. This is because only devices in the network that have password protection on them already will be listed here. So in case that you have only factory default devices with a factory default configuration, there won't be any devices listed here because they simply do not have a password configured on them yet. But in case there is a device with a password that you're attempting to add into the configuration, you need to enter the username and password for this device that has been configured, and as soon as that has been successfully authenticated, you can move on to the next step. And because any device that currently does not have a password yet, in the final step of the configuration wizard will receive a global password that has to be assigned to all cameras at the same time. So now we move on to step 7, which is the recording profiles. And what you will see here is that you simply have a drop-down menu of the recording profiles that can be selected, and these are the default configured recording profiles. So for example, we have made a selection of profiles, one being recording, a second being alarm recording, or a combination of continuous and alarm recording, as well as a no recording setting. And the key point to keep in mind here is that any profile that you select here will be assigned to all devices that I have previously selected in my device selection step. So if I have the need to set up part of my cameras with a different profile than another half of my cameras, I need to run through the wizard twice and only add the devices at that time that I want to assign the recording profile selected on here. So imagine a scenario where I have 10 cameras, 5 I want to have with a basic recording profile, and 5 I would like to have with an alarm recording profile. Then I will first run the wizard and select the 5 cameras I want to assign the recording profile to. Then I'll finalize my wizard configuration, and I'll attempt to restart the wizard again, adding the remaining 5 cameras that I would like to assign the alarm recording profile to. And then I will simply select that once more here in the step 7, and that in the end gets me to the result where I have 10 cameras added into the system with 2 different recording profiles. So then we move on to step 8, where we are going to add our storage to record on. Now you'll see at the left screenshot that at the bottom it is mentioned in green that the internal storage is already present in the configuration. And this is because by default the storage inside your Divar IP3 or 7000 will be automatically placed in the configuration, so there is no need to select or configure these from this particular step. Of course, if I have a Divar IP3 or 7000 that I would like to configure with additional storage, then I manually need to click the Add Storage button here. I'll receive a pop-up window where I have to fill in the IP address as well as the storage type based on what I would like to add into the configuration. So the one thing that it requires action for you on in this step is if I want to use an external storage device that is outside of my Divar IP unit. And as soon as you've filled in the correct information here, the storage will be added into the configuration in addition to the Divar IP internal storage. So we move on to step 9, where we manage our user accounts. You'll see that by default there will be 2 user groups configured, one being the admin group and one being the operator group. These are 2 user groups that have been configured in the system by default, and from this step we can simply add users to the existing user groups. If there is a need to configure additional user groups, we need to first configure these through the configuration client, which we'll be addressing later in the session. And then when you run the wizard again, that's when they will be made available inside the step 9 of the wizard. But for now, you can just add a user. You would select your user group and then click the Add User button, which will generate a pop-up window where the first step is the login name, so the name used to log into the client itself. Then you can give a full name of the person using this login name, as well as a description, perhaps of what team or any other desirable text you would like to include with use of the username in the description field. So as soon as we have added all the users that we like, we basically have run through the majority of the wizard, and we can actually start moving into finishing the configuration. Now if you look firstly on the left screenshot, you'll see that at the top of the screen there's a section, the global default password. The password I am entering here will be assigned to my video recording manager, as well as any encoder, camera or decoder that I have previously selected to be included in the configuration. So you'll see below that there is a summary of the devices that I am going to add into my configuration. And just keep in mind that the password that you're entering here, that will be automatically assigned to all devices. Because we are, of course, doing it through the BVMS configuration wizard, the first time I start up my client, my BVMS system will already have the information of this global default password and will therefore be able to automatically authenticate the devices. But if in any case you would need to manually authenticate towards a device, just keep in mind that this is the password that you would then need to use for both the service, live, and user accounts. If I do not fill in a global default password here, I will be unable to save and activate my configuration. So keep in mind that the wizard will inform you that you have not filled in the password, and it is an absolute requirement to be able to continue. So as soon as you've filled in the password, verified in the summary of devices adding into the system that everything is correct, then you have the green button at the bottom which says Save and Activate. And as soon as you press this button, the configuration will be actively pushed into the Divar IP itself and immediately will start taking effect. So any cameras configured for recording, as soon as I receive the message that the configuration activation is succeeded, will start recording already into my system as soon as I receive this confirmation. Now on the right hand side, then you will have a button that was previously grayed out, which is the Save Backup Copy. As soon as my configuration is saved and activated, this button will become available for me to click. And as soon as I click it, it will open a Windows-based Explorer window, so to say, where I can define a location where I want to save this element's backup copy. And the name can be fully changed according to what makes it easier for you to identify, but the Save As type has to remain .bvms for the system to be able to recognize this as a valid configuration file to be used inside BVMS. Now, and then this is also the file that we can then use to import an existing configuration. So you could imagine if you have multiple locations where the IP address configuration, the amount of cameras, etc. will be identical to what I'm setting up here, I can simply use this file, import it into a different Divar IP with use of the wizard, and then it would take away the need for me to have to manually configure each system individually, but I can simply use a elements backup file to load this configuration into different units as well. So how do we exactly go about this? We would move, if on a different Divar IP or on the same one, to recover my current configuration, we would move to step 4 of the wizard, press the import configuration button, and then it will take me to, again, a Windows-based open prompt where I have to select the file from the hard drive of the Divar IP. So this is a requirement to previously have it available on either a USB stick or on the hard drive of the Divar IP itself before I can select it. As soon as I've selected the correct file, a pop-up window will come asking me to authenticate the configuration that I have just loaded with use of the administrator user and its password. And this is a requirement to avoid locking yourself out by importing a configuration that you do not know the administrator login details from. Now, if I entered the correct details and hit OK, the configuration will actually be placed as an available configuration into the wizard. The wizard will restart and load this configuration into the steps, but it has not taken effect yet on the system. So you still have to complete the full 10 steps, albeit that the devices that you had in the configuration available will be automatically selected when clicking through the steps of the wizard, and then you would just have to go to the final step 10 to save and activate the configuration again, and this will then be placed into the Divar IP and will start taking effect immediately. And this is from a wizard point of view, the basic setup that we can do. Of course, as mentioned, if there's any additional configuration required, we have to move towards the BVMS configuration client. And here we have a overview of the configuration client application itself, where we have in a logical fashion laid out from left to right all the steps that we have to complete in order to get to a successful full working configuration of the system. The same way effectively as the wizard would work. So if you always keep the order for yourself that I'm starting at the utmost left menu option and start working my way towards the final configuration step, which is the user groups, then at least I can have the guarantee that I didn't miss any pre-required step in between to get to the desired configuration as I would like it. So as I said, the starting point should always be the devices menu, which will allow me to add, delete, and configure devices, encoders, decoders, BRM, DBOS, BRS, and DVR units, etc. So this is always where I perform my initial work. Now the device tree itself, before we get started, is designed in a hierarchical fashion by device type, and you'll see that for some device types there's in brackets behind the name there's a number listed. This means that when the section is truncated, it will provide you with a number, the amount of configurable options that are behind this menu if I expand it with use of the plus sign. If there are no additional options behind it, then what I see, that is immediately also where I have to start adding my devices from. So before we get actually into the adding and configuring of devices, just some use cases of what is important when we start using the configuration client, and also some system-wide options that we can configure from this configuration client. So what you always should keep in mind is, and at whatever menu tab you perform your work, any changes that you make will have to obviously be saved. And you'll see that a change needs to be saved as soon as you see the floppy disk icon below the devices menu light up. And by pressing this button, you will save your work, but it will not be pushed yet into the active configuration of the system. So you can then step by step ensure that the work you're doing in the Devices tab or in the Maps and Structures or in the Schedules tab is saved, and as long as you hold for yourself that at each menu option you perform a save, then move on to the next one, you avoid losing any previous configuration made. As soon as you have clicked the Save icon, you'll see that a different icon then becomes available, which is a green button with a yellow hand. And this is the actual activation of the configuration. And by pushing this button, it will push any settings that I have previously changed or made into my system and will place them inside the active configuration of the system. And as soon as the process of activation has completed, the configuration that I have just made will be made active into the system and will immediately start taking effect. So this is actually the pop-up screen that we get when clicking the activation button, where here a very important field is the description. To make your life a lot easier, always ensure that you create a clear and useful description text here to know what possible changes you have made in this activation of the configuration, because, and we will get to that in the next slide, we always have the option to revert back to a previously activated configuration. And of course, if you do not use a clear description, it's very hard, especially over time, to know exactly what the details were of the configuration change that you made in this particular activation. Then we still have two activation options. One being is set a delayed activation time. So what this will do is at a later point in time, it will activate the configuration for you. So if we make the changes at, let's say, 9 o'clock in the morning, but we are not allowed to activate the configuration yet until 9 in the evening, we can set up the date and time in such a way that the configuration changes have been made, but they will not be pushed yet into the active configuration, only in a delayed fashion at the exact time that you specify. And this could help with having, for example, a maintenance window in which you're not allowed to make a configuration change, but eliminates the need to have to be on site for this particular configuration change, or at least behind the Divar IP at that time. Then finally, we have a force activation for all operator clients. The idea behind this is that normally if I do not mark this checkbox and I activate my configuration, any operator currently connected to the system will receive a notification pop-up saying if he wants to activate the configuration or not. So it gives him the option to run in an out of synchronized mode towards the latest available configuration, or to say immediately, no, I want to activate this configuration right now, which would cause his client application to restart. Now if I mark the force activation, I will simply take this option away from the operator connected to the system. So he will, as soon as I push here the OK button with the force activation enabled, it will automatically restart his client, and when it boots up again, it will have the new configuration in there. So this could be a decision made by the administrator of the system to say, if I'm making a critical configuration change that I want to have applied to everybody connected to my system right away, then this is the option for me to use. Of course, this will, if any operator is currently working on something, it will lose that progress that he was working on, because the client will restart immediately after activation of the configuration. Now if we go into the System tab at the top of the application where we have the Activation Manager, you can now see here why it is so important to give a clear description of what activation you have made at any given time. Because you can see here that at the course of a day, In approximately less than an hour, we have made 6 configuration changes, but without any clear description, it is extremely hard to identify what changes I made during this particular activation of my configuration. So this is again to see the end result of what you would see if you do not use a proper description. And of course, simply by selecting any earlier made activation from this drop-down list, by selecting them, clicking the activate button, we'll roll back to this previous configuration, and of course any activations that are in this list that have been made after the configuration that we roll back to will be removed, because that particular point in time the configuration was unaware of any newer configurations that were available for the system to be used. Then we have a refresh state button, which is located under the Maps and Structures tab. And basically what this does, this sends a ping request to all the devices connected to my system to verify if their status is set to online or offline. In the past, we had this in such a way that this was performed automatically on a time basis. And what has been done now to reduce unnecessary network traffic created by these constant device status requests, we do not ping these devices automatically anymore. So now you have under your control when do you want to verify if my connection to a device is currently online or offline. Then you simply press the refresh states button, and you will be indicated to all devices added to my system whether or not they are online or offline. And finally, we have here the settings menu, where we have an options field, which will open a new pop-up window where we have, in this case, 3 options that are interesting for us. The first being the language of the configuration client in which it starts. Now, by default, it will take the system language of the Windows environment that I'm running. But it could be that I would say, look, I want to have my Windows environment in English. However, I would like to run my configuration client in Swedish, Finnish, German, French, any other language that you desire. You can select this from a drop-down menu here, and every instance after that you start up the configuration client, it will be in the selected language that you have defined here. Then on the right-hand side of that, we have a similar scan option as we have in the configuration wizard. The default being only in the local subnet, so in my local segment of the network, but I have the option to change this to scan across several subnets if, again, the setup of my physical network itself allows me to. So this is again an option to consider: where are my devices located, and is there a need for me to enable this cross subnet option or not? Because if you do not need it, do not enable it, because the only thing it does is generate unnecessary traffic across the network. And a final setting here that we can enable is the analog monitor group display. By default, these would only be available for a workstation that is actually entered into my configuration, that also requires a license for me to add a workstation into the configuration, but it doesn't prevent me, if it's not in my configuration, to connect via this workstation to my Divar IP. So if I enable this checkbox, any analog monitor group, so an analog monitor wall that is configured in my system, will be made available for a workstation that is not present in my configuration. So if we actually then start looking at the device tree itself to start adding devices into the system, we'll go through some of the more common devices that we add into our system that we also offer in our portfolio. The first being a DBoS or Bosch recording station. As you'll see, that as soon as we select the Bosch recording station option and right click, we will have the option to manually add a BRS or DWAS system. Then it will request for me a certain set of information, being the network address, the username and password. And keep in mind that the username that should be entered here should always be the administrator user, because with using the administrator user we can guarantee that all the configuration made on the Bosch recording station will be successfully imported into the BVMS system. If we do not use the administrator here, there is a risk that we will be unable to authenticate, or even not being able to retrieve the correct configuration from the unit itself. So as soon as I have entered my correct network address and credentials, I can hit the Scan DWAS button, and a status bar will come up where it starts actively scanning towards this network address to see if it is really a DWAS or BRS unit. And as soon as this has been successfully scanned, you will receive a notification that the device has been successfully scanned, and will be then placed as a sub-menu option under the main DWAS/Bosch recording station option. And the cameras are then imported and made available for BVMS to use these devices. Now the key here to keep in mind is that the configuration of the Bosch recording station still has to be performed from the recording station itself, and the only thing that BVMS is doing here is importing this information into its own configuration and using the devices that have been set up inside the BRS unit, rather than saying I can make configuration changes to my BRS unit from my BVMS client. So that is not possible. So always ensure that your unit is pre-configured before you start scanning it into the system. Then we have the option to add DVRs into the configuration. We have support for our 400, 600, and 700 series devices, and there will be several services running in order to successfully set up a connection to this Divar unit. These of course will already be pre-installed, and there is no need for you to start addressing the setting up of the services, because everything with the Divar IP comes pre-configured. The one thing we need to keep in mind is that the number of DVRs that we can add into the configuration of a Divar IP is limited to 10. And each DVR has the support for 5 connections. Now effectively, what does this mean? It means that I will always have one connection active from my Divar IP to the DVR for the retrieving of events and the management towards the device. So that leaves me with 4 remaining connections, and I can have 4 simultaneous connections in that case to a DVR for either live or playback. So this comes into play when I have additional clients configured into my Divar IP to view out the configuration. That's when this limitation becomes important. So to add these devices, again, it's the mechanism of right-clicking the main DVR option, and then you'll see that in this case we have 2 instead of 1 options. We have the ability here to scan for the devices as well. So we can here make the decision, do I want to scan based on the DVRs connected in my network, or do I know the IP address, the username and the password from my head, and do I simply want to add them manually? Then I can here make the choice of scanning or manually adding them into the configuration. So with adding it manually, the same process as with the BRS unit, network address, administrator username and the password, and then perform a scan into the system. Or if we select it from the Scan Wizard menu, we simply mark a checkbox next to the units that we would like to add into the configuration, and then we hit the Next on the Configuration tab, and then I need to set up the authentication here for my DVR, which I would have to fill in the username and password that I have configured on the DVR itself again, with the ability to test the authentication that I have entered in here, either being test the selected device or test all devices that I'm adding into my configuration at once. And you'll see that in the status field next to the password will indicate to me if I have successfully authenticated my to my DVR and if it's ready to be added into the configuration. As soon as I've verified that the authentication is indeed correct, I can click the Finish button, and then you will see that it will be placed under the main menu option as a DVR with its type number and the IP address behind it. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here is that BVMS will import any camera, input, or relay that the device is capable of using. It doesn't mean that these are actually going to be in use. So, for example, if I have 16 camera inputs on my DVR, but I have disabled 8 of them, I will still see in my cameras tab the full 16 cameras that the device is capable of displaying, and I manually have to remove them in the corresponding either cameras, inputs, or relay tabs, and remove them out of the configuration and designate them to not be used by BVMS. So just run through some of the limitations again, where mentioned we have 10 DVRs per Divar IP system. An IP camera can only be added to the Divar IP once. So if we have an IP camera already assigned to a DVR, we cannot add it into our configuration somewhere else under a different sub-device. The intuitive way, though, is that the application will report that if you're trying to add a device with the same IP address twice, that this is not possible. Another limitation is that we cannot display a camera from a DVR onto a decoder, as there is no support yet for decoder connections. And the PTZ protocols and permissions will be set during the scanning of the DVR. And again here, this is why it's also important to use the administrator account, because if we do not use the administrator account, the BVMS is unable to retrieve the correct protocols and permissions when it comes to PTZ cameras. And the relays itself present on the DVR can be switched and used from the operator client logical tree by double-clicking them, but with the exception that we do not support the control of virtual alarm inputs of a DVR 700. So if we then start looking at adding an additional workstation into our configuration, so if I have next to my client that I can run from my Divar IP a workstation somewhere else in the network that I would like to enable to view cameras from my Divar IP system, I can add them as a workstation. Again, the mechanism, right-clicking the workstation's main menu will pop up a new option to add a workstation, and then we have two options to enter the network address. The first being the actual IP address of the workstation we're trying to add, or the DNS name that has been assigned to the device is also valid to add the workstation to the configuration with. Now, as soon as we have added a workstation into our configuration, we have, as a selection menu, a certain set of options that we can use. Now, in this case, which is a primarily important one when using the Divar IP, is to enable the forensic search, because this will allow us to search the metadata of recorded video of an IVA, an intelligent video analysis capable camera. If I do not mark this checkbox, then the metadata will still be logged, but I have never the option to search through my recorded video for specific values such as a red car, a blue bag, etc. So that is a main requirement here. The other settings that we have are for a Divar IP system use, generally not so important. with the exception then of having a keyboard connected to it, so a CCTV keyboard. And we support both the use of a USB keyboard, and the one that we have enabled to be used with this one is a Videotech DCZ USB keyboard. And for the serial keyboard that we can use, we have our IntuiKey keyboard. The one thing to know, to be able to connect this to the Divar IP, you need to use a serial to USB converter, because there is no serial port physically on the Divar IP itself. If we then start moving into adding decoders, so to have a decoder possibly to connect to a monitor group or monitor wall inside our configuration, we move into the monitors section, and basically from there on out it is a 2 or 3 step process to get a decoder assigned to the monitor wall and add them into the system. Now we have 2 different options of adding a decoder, which you will see in a little bit, because when we right click the decoders, we just have the option to manually add them from here. So we say add decoder, enter the IP address, and then with a drop down menu you can select the exact device type or the decoder type that you have and enter it into the configuration like that. But by default you will also see that there is an auto detect function there, and this could be used to add in a new device that has not with its full device type been implemented into BVMS yet. But it can also be used for a known device type, and then the Divar IP will simply attempt to retrieve the capabilities of that particular device and assign those capabilities to the automatic detection of the decoder. The second step in adding a decoder is to create a monitor group. And the key is we have here an analog monitor group or a digital monitor wall. And the determination for me, if I'm using, for example, a digital decoder, would be if I have the need to display alarm connections on my monitor wall. If I, when an alarm for a certain camera comes in, want to display video on my monitor group, I always need to select this option here to add the monitor group, because with a digital monitor wall we do not have the option to perform this. The one thing is though that if you add a decoder into an analog monitor group, it has a maximum capability of displaying video in a quad view. Even if the device is capable of performing more, the adding it into the analog monitor group limits my capabilities to having either a single or quad view. So if we start looking into adding the monitor group, again, right click, add monitor group, then it comes up with a name field where I can fill in the name and have to define the amount of columns or rows. Now in this example, a monitor group of 2 by 2, so 2 columns, 2 rows, would accommodate 4 decoders. And that looks like this. So basically you will make one logical group that consists of 4 physical monitors, and to each monitor I can assign a decoder that has been added into my configuration and not previously assigned yet to a different monitor group or monitor wall. And then it's a matter of selecting the device from the table on the left and simply dragging and dropping them into the desired monitor on the right hand side where I would like to use them. If the connection is valid and active towards the decoder, you will see that the screen itself turns blue, and at the right bottom there will be a green status light marking that the connection is indeed active, as well as the logical number of the monitor being displayed in the bottom middle of the screen. Now then I have a second tab, which is the advanced configuration of an analog monitor group. And here I can assign a decoder to, by default, start up in single view or in quad view. And by selecting the quad view, you will see that instead of having one line for the decoder, it will display, as shown in the screenshot, will display 4 lines of the monitor itself. And then on the right hand side, I can define an initial camera. So this is whenever my application starts up, what is the initial camera that is placed on that particular section of the monitor. And even in addition to that, I can include an on-screen display of the camera name and the camera number. And as soon as I make either of these two selections, you'll see that on the right hand side, the on-screen display position becomes available for me to select, and I can define top, bottom, etc. I can define the physical location on the monitor where this text will be displayed. Now if we then look into adding a digital monitor wall, we can actually allow the addition of a full digital decoder. So this is where we can make full use of the capabilities of a digital decoder, as opposed to assigning it to an analog monitor group where we're limited to quad view. The difference here is more that you would right-click the digital wall, select Add Monitor Wall, then you have to provide a name for this monitor wall, and you have to, from a drop-down menu, select any of the unassigned decoders that are listed there to place them onto this monitor wall configuration. Now then, below that is an option of maximum number of monitors. What you have to see is, in this case, imagine that we have a device or a decoder capable of displaying 30 cameras simultaneously. By me entering a value here of 25, the configuration will not allow me to place more than 25 cameras onto this particular digital monitor wall. So think of what is the worst case scenario of maximum amount of cameras that I want to be displaying, and then you can limit it already in the maximum number of monitors that value will never be exceeded. Now then, finally, to start looking into recording into our system, we need to add a video recording manager into our BVMS system. And this can be done in 2 ways. The first one being manually adding a device, or again using the scan wizard to select them automatically from a drop-down list into our configuration. So if we look at the scanning mechanism, as mentioned, we right-click the VRM devices, select Scan VRM Devices, and that will bring up a list where I can select the VRM from and authenticate with it. If I'm looking at manually adding a VRM device, you will see that if I click Add VRM, a pop-up window will be displayed, and then I have to fill in the name I want to assign to this video recording manager, the network address, and the username and password. And the username and password by default are set to the username being SRV admin without a password. So if I have it in a default state, that is the credentials that I need to use, and after that I will simply hit OK. And the VRM will be added into my configuration so that I can start assigning storage devices and cameras to be recorded onto my Divar IP. So when the VRM is added into the configuration, you will see immediately that below the device that I have given a name, there will be a pool 0. And from this menu, I have to manually select, I have the option to manually select some numbers, as well as assign a name to the pool. Now, if we're looking at the preferred settings, the recording preferences mode would be automatic. There is an option to configure a manual failover state here, but I would say for systems covering the Divar IP and using it in there, the automatic mode will be the most preferred one for you to use, and actually will allow you to make full use of any storage devices added into your system, and will automatically perform equal load balancing across the different iSCSI targets. Then we have a option called the secondary target usage, and this becomes important to know when I know the amount of iSCSI devices in my configuration. If I have only one iSCSI device, so let's say the internal storage of my Divar IP, the recommended setting to place on the secondary target usage is off. If I have added any additional outside storage device into my configuration that I would like to include in my recording configuration, that's the only scenario where I need to place the secondary target usage to on. And finally, we have a block reservation for downtime. This would be a setting that tells me for how long can my cameras be recording while my VRM service is offline. Now I would say for the Divar IP, this does not become such an interesting setting because everything is physically located into the same unit. So most likely if you have a scenario in which your VRM isn't functioning, you will already be working on the server unit itself and work from there. Now the next step would be to start adding encoders into our configuration, into our VRM. In addition to adding an encoder or a camera to the VRM, we also have the option to add them as a live-only device or as a local storage device. A local storage device being with an SD card or an encoder with a compact flash card. And again, here we have the option to manually add or use the scan wizard. So what we do is we select the pool where we would like to be adding our encoders to, and then we'll see that at the top we have the add encoders option to manually do it, where we have to manually enter in all the information, and the second option from the bottom is to scan the encoders, which will open up a selection scanning window that again detects all the cameras and or encoders in my network, and I have the option to assign these to my Divar IP one by one, or simply add all scanned cameras and encoders into my configuration by clicking the Assign All button. Then it will take me into a authentication screen again, where if I have a username and password, have to fill it in. I can test the selected devices or all devices, and then proceed to saving my configuration once successfully authenticated. If we look at manually adding a device, then of course we select the Add Encoder type. Then we enter the IP address, select the encoder type from a drop-down list, and simply say Add into the configuration. And finally, of course, we have our encoders and cameras into the configuration. We need to start assigning storage where these devices can actually record on. Right-click the pool, add iSCSI device, and then we fill in the name we want to assign to it, the network address, and from a drop-down list, select the storage type that we are adding into the configuration. Of course, if we're looking at manually adding a storage appliance, which could be a Divar IP 6000 being added into a Divar IP 7000, we can do this with two ways, because the Divar IP 6000 also comes with a VRM service pre-installed on the unit. We can import that full with use of the VRM on it, but most likely you'll be using it as a storage device only, because the Divar IP 7000 itself already is providing the VRM functionality. then you simply fill in the name, the network address, and from the drop-down menu again the device type that you would like to use, and enter any password that has been configured on the unit. And by hitting OK, it places the Divar IP 6000 into the configuration of the Divar IP 7000 to be used as external storage. So once we have added the storage into the system, we need to perform a scan of the target, and you'll see if we select the target that has been scanned, we will have an overview of the LUN numbers where in the ideal circumstances you'll see the overview as we have on the left, where the LUNs have been formatted 100% progress and are ready to be used. There could be a scenario in which they will return here a state of unformatted. Then you need to select all the LUNs individually, and as soon as you have made a selection of LUNs, the Format LUN button at the right top will become available, and you will perform a format of the LUNs. So keep in mind that any storage, any video that was stored on these LUNs before, if it was already used in an older system before, that it will be lost as soon as you perform this action. Now, if we have set up our VRM and our pools, our storage device, and our cameras, and in this case, we have, by clicking the camera, opens up all the camera configuration related options, and we just want to highlight one at this moment, which for the Dinian IP 7000 HD would be the Lens Wizard, where you can use the motorized back focus to focus a camera automatically. Now you'll see that if you open this on the Divar IP the first time, it will open a web browser for you, but you'll see that in the middle of the screen that it says that the image decoder, so the image decoder inside the browser that is needed to display the video, has not been installed yet. So what you will do is you will click the message itself, which will trigger the download of a small file. You can select to run this file as soon as it's successfully downloaded, and then you need to perform a reload of the page and allow the web page to run the image decoder itself. And as soon as you have performed that, you will see that the video is displayed. The one thing then to do here in a selection before continuing is to determine what type of DC iris lens you have. Is it a normal or an SR lens? As soon as you have selected that, you can hit the center button to set the back focus to a center position. From that moment onward, you can proceed to setting the field of view that the camera has to look at manually, and to a reasonable degree shift the focus of the camera manually to be somewhat correct, so we're not too far out of the range of where eventually we would need to calibrate the focus to. As soon as these steps have been performed, we can continue onwards to step 2, which is on the right hand side above the video, which will actually start with doing the focus range configuration. On the left hand top, you see that there is a small preview window with a reddish overlay. This is where you can select either the full screen to be focusing on or a specific section on the field of view of the camera that you would like to focus on. Once you have selected the range or the focus area where you would like to be performing the focus on, you can hit the full range autofocus button. If you are close to the camera, you will start hearing somewhat of a motorized sound, and you'll see that the focus position slider bars for day and night will start moving from left to right, and it will start looking into the full range of what the camera can perform to find the most optimal focus state. As soon as this is finished, you would see that if the values that you have entered regarding the lens and everything are correct, then you'll see that you will get a more focused image, and then you actually have your camera ready to be used within the system and in focus. So then once this is completed, you're happy with the end result, then you can close the browser session again and move back to the BVMS configuration client. So the next step that we have to address from the configuration client is, now that we have added our devices into the system, it doesn't mean directly yet they will be made available when I log in with my operator client application. So what I need to do here is a user-defined structure of what devices I would like to see when I log into my operator client. Now you'll see that on the left-hand side, you'll have the exact same device tree as we had on the Devices tab. And there are 3 options at the top. If I know prior to dragging cameras into my logical tree that I know if I'm not going to be adding relays or inputs, that I can deselect them of being displayed in the list, as you'll see at the 2 screenshots under it. And from there on out, it makes it easier for me to have less options to find certain devices, and also not add anything that I do not wish to add. From there on out, it's a simple matter of selecting the camera that you would like to see in your operator client and drag it to the right where it says the logical tree. And with a side note here that the analog monitor group is already available for the whole system-wide configuration. The digital monitor wall here has to be treated like a camera and also be selected and dragged and dropped into the logical tree if I would like to use it from my operator client application. Now we have some additional features that we can add into our configuration, and most of these external resources, as we would call them, are handled from the resource manager. I can already set up a camera sequence as well. So an automated tour of several cameras that I will include in a sequence with a timeout value that I will define, which will automatically run as soon as I use this in the operator client, where then I have a pre-configured tour of cameras. On the right-hand side, we have the option to add folders, so create a folder structure, use maps, add documents, and add sub-programs. Now we'll be focusing on the folders and maps for now. So yeah, as I said, a folder is the same way as you would have it on your PC. You can offer a logical way of sorting your devices in. So if you could say I have a building with 3 floors, you can make 3 folders, one being the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, and you'll logically place the devices to the corresponding floor into these folders. Another important thing is as well that if you would have if you would like to assign some restrictions to what cameras people can access, you can, for example, create 2 folders, one being a general camera folder and 2 with high priority or restricted cameras that at a later stage on a user level or on a user group level, we can restrict access only to certain users to that particular restricted camera folder. Then we have our maps, and the maps are basically site maps that I can use to place my cameras on. So you could imagine if I have a floor plan of my first floor, my second floor, and third floor, I can assign that to the particular map, or to the particular folder, and then place my cameras on this sitemap exactly where they are located in the field. So it makes it easier for me to localize or to find a device based on its actual position in the system. And as well, we have the opportunity to import documents into the client. They can be either in text, HTML, HTML, MHT, or URL format. So if we start looking at the concept of adding folders and resources into the logical tree, we have the Add Folder icon. As soon as you click the Add Folder icon, a new folder will be placed inside the logical tree, from which there I can change the name of the folder or and then start actually progressing into dragging my particular devices, be it cameras, inputs, relays, documents, etc. I can drag them into this particular folder. Once I have done that, I can, by right-clicking the folder itself, decide to assign a map. So then I will have a map that only applies to that particular folder that I will be assigning it to. And if I do that, it will open the resource manager for me. The one step that I have to take is to click the plus icon or the import of files into the resource manager. Then I have to navigate to the location on my hard drive where I have all these maps available. I will select whichever many maps simultaneously as I would like to add, being it one or multiple. I'll select which ones I want, hit open, and the one requirement being is that they have to be in DWF format. Now you'll see that as soon as we have done that, the icon on the folder itself changes. It will actually have a compass displayed on the folder, indicating to me that this is a folder with a map assigned to it. Then I can select by right-clicking the preview of the map next to the logical tree. I can say that I would like to create links, and from there on out I can actually select a map from the pop-up menu to link to this one. If we're looking at having our cameras, inputs, relays, etc. on the map, they will always be placed the first time you would like to set them up on the left-hand side of the map itself. Now it might be that the icon size is at such a small state that you will not be able to properly see them. That's why at the top of the map you can use the slider bar to increase the size of the icons, and then for a short period of time you can increase the icon size, then drag them and drop them on the map where you would like to display them, and as soon as they are placed there you can decide to decrease the size slightly so that they won't take up too much space on the map itself. And this is then basically what we can set up from the logical tree. So whichever you would like to see displayed, keep in mind that that these are the options that we have. And if we then move on to the third step in our configuration client, which is the Schedules tab, this is actually where we set up either a recording or a task schedule. And when it becomes important here is that I can have my cameras recording in a certain quality depending on the schedule as I define it here. I can either decide to say I'm going to make the full Monday to Sunday period all day, which means that for the entire duration of the week I will always be recording in the same quality, and that I'm not expecting a change in quality based on the time schedule that I have set up. But you can do it in such a way as you see here, where we have the blue night and the green weekend parts in the schedule, that during this time frame either I record in a lower or higher quality than I would during the daytime period. Now how do we go about doing this? If you would like to apply a certain time schedule to the schedule itself, then you click on the left-hand side for example, day, night, or weekend with a specific color. Then you go onto the schedule itself, and by clicking and then holding the mouse button and dragging them over the desired time part, you can select a period of time being different than the default configured value. So set it up to whatever extent you would like it to have it yourself. Now you'll see that next to the weekdays, we also have two additional tabs, the holidays and exception days. The holidays come with a pre-configured 25 set of holidays. And whenever holiday I select here, I have the option to define a different time schedule to them. So I could say that if it is New Year's Day, then I can have it in the same quality level recording as I would have during the day schedule or the night schedule or any other of my custom-made schedules that I have set up myself. Now, these are, of course, as we say, limited to 25 holidays. Now, it could be that there are some country-specific holidays that are not listed in these holidays. Then we have set up the exception days, which is basically the same concept, that for one particular day per year, I can have a different change of quality. If this, for example, falls on a weekday, I can still say I would like to apply a different type of recording schedule for this particular day. The one key point to keep in mind here compared to the holidays is that a holiday will be recurring every year for no matter how long the system runs. If I set up an exception day, I have to define this day for each year additionally. So I have to set it up for 2014, 2015, 2016, etc. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. If I want to prepare the system for 2-3 years in advance, that I need to add 3 exception days to accomplish this, or 1 day for a 3-year period. Now, that is actually what we have then finished to setting up our schedules. And then we can actually start moving into the cameras and recording tab to also apply these schedules, of course, to a recording scenario. But the first step that we always have here is that the basic camera configurations are listed under the All option that will appear there. Now, what do we have there? We have the menu that will allow us to change camera names, enable audio, and define a encoder to have a PTZ camera connected and include both the port, protocol, and camera number. So if we look in more detail, you'll see that the first time we have a number here, it is a logical number added to BVMS. This is simply a unique number within the system that a camera can be addressed on. And that's why we call it a logical number. Then we have next to that the audio section. If a device supports audio, then in this drop-down menu, I'll have the audio source listed and available to be selected. Of course, if the device does not support any audio connections, the only thing that I will see in the drop-down menu in here is a no audio. So whatever source is available to be selected or not available will be displayed in the drop-down menu here. If we start looking into the pan tilt zoom settings, the first thing that we have to do is mark the checkbox under the dome icon to enable that this is actually a PTZ camera. Then the second thing what we have to do is to say on which port this is connected, and what the protocol is. Now you'll generally see that if we have a Bosch camera connected, it will be either be with the Bosch Autodome protocol, or if it's a BICOM connection, with the Bosch Autodome BiLinks protocol. As you'll see, of course, that there are some additional protocols that we support as well, but before you would move into seeing if you can use a particular protocol, just always verify that it's present here in the drop-down list to be able to be used. And finally, we can apply the PTZ address, and depending on the type of camera connected, there might be a need to have a fixed PTZ address to be entered there that you would usually find in the manual of the camera itself to say, okay, this is the PTZ address that needs to be connected. So we're telling the BVMS application that it knows on what address it has to initiate the control of the PTZ device. If we would then switch instead of from the all mode to our VRM mode at the top of the screen, we'll have some additional options where we can set up stream qualities and stream codecs, as well as what live stream should be displayed. So you'll see that you will always have two streams listed. The first being the codec, what you can imagine there that this is either MPEG-4, H.264, 720p HD, 1080p HD, or even in some cases megapixel resolutions. The second option, the quality, refers more to the amount of images per second that we can apply to it. So it doesn't say anything yet about the codec, but what specific values do we apply to, for example, the HD stream that we have selected. Now you'll see that by default there will be a list of 5 quality profiles, with the normal, good, and excellent primarily intended to be used with SD cameras, so standard definition, and then we have 2 pre-configured HD quality profiles that we have set up for 720p and 1080p cameras. And based on the configuration that I've made in my Stream 1 and Stream 2, I can decide which one of these streams do I want to see in my operator client when I want to see these cameras in live. So I can say if I have a Stream 1 in 1080p HD and a Stream 2 in H.264 standard definition, I can decide, do I want to see the HD stream or do I want to see the SD stream? Now if we start looking into the stream quality settings, so where we actually set up these quality profiles, you'll see that the same way as next to the profile itself, there was a small diamond icon at the top of the menu. We will have a diamond icon to open the stream quality settings configuration menu. And here you have the option to edit any of the previous set up recording profiles, or to create a complete new profile from scratch, however you would like to have it set up. And in this case, the primary configuration option that you would see would be deemed as important is the image encoding interval, where you set how many images per second will I be displaying, where 25 in PAL resolution being the highest. And by simply moving the slider bar from the left hand to the right hand side, you will decrease the amount of images per second to whatever value you would like to set this up yourself. Of course, this can have to do with available bandwidth throughout the network, depending on the amount of and type of cameras and the network that they're located on. And one more, where if you have an idea of the bit rates that you would like to set up, this is also the location where to change it. But I would say, seeing as we have set up these profiles by default based on what we consider to be good values compared to quality level, if you do not have a specific requirement of changing these values because of the knowledge that you have that this is what it has to be maximum, for example, you could use the default values configured in the profiles. When it comes to the remaining options, generally it is a best use case to leave these to automatic, and only in certain support related cases somebody from Bosch could ask you to set these values to a fixed value but the recommended way is to leave them on automatic so that the system itself can determine the most accurate values for the camera to be using. Then next to the stream quality settings, we have a scheduled recording setting button. And this is where we actually define the specifics of the recording profile as we have it. So you'll see here that you have the same 6 pre-configured profiles that were available in the BVMS configuration wizard in the beginning. And this is actually where you see the specifics of what each of these profiles actually consist of. So you could see in this case, you have to walk through the steps of what you would like to set up. If you would simply like to have continuous recording or alarm recording, and once you have either created or selected the profile that you would like to edit, you'll see at the top that the first setting, of course, is to have recording on or off. Well, most likely you will be placing it here into on. Then the second option is to select the recording mode, and this would either be pre-alarm or continuous recording. The preferred way, I would say, is to have it set here to continuous recording based on the storage usage. But if you would say, I only want to record a certain period of time before an alarm was triggered in my system and a period of time after an alarm was triggered in my system, then this is the setting you need to use. Then, based on your stream configuration that you have done previously, you'll determine here when I have this pre-alarm recording or continuous recording, what stream would I like to use. So you have the option to use stream 1 or stream 2. When you look into the quality, by default it will be set to no modification. If it is set to no modification, it will use the quality settings profile that you have assigned to it in the main window for both the stream 1 and stream 2. But you can say here that if an alarm comes in, I would like to increase the quality profile that I have defined normally and run this, for example, instead of the normal profile, I would now like to use the excellent profile. And finally, you then determine what you want the duration of the pre-alarm to be. Below that, we actually move into the recording of the alarm event itself, where you'll say, do we want to enable this, yes or no? Do I want to record, or do I want to have an motion alarm recording scenario? So I have to make the decision, do I want this on or off, as well as having the stream selection, the quality profile selection for the duration of this alarm being recorded, and finally the duration of the post-alarm. So that means for how long do I want to keep recording after my alarm state has returned to normal. And if you would say you can go from a minimum of 10 seconds to a maximum of 3 hours. If you would be going into a post-alarm time of 3 hours, I would say it's probably a better idea to consider going into a continuous recording mode, because generally speaking, the post-alarm time should be for a short period of time after a specific event has occurred, rather than saying I would like to have 3 hours pre-alarm and 3 hours post-alarm. Now, of course, to perform the alarm-based recording, or to have any alarm and event-related scenario kick in, I need to have an event as well as an alarm configured. Now, the way it has been set up in BVMS is that you cannot have an alarm without having an event. So the first step is always to move into the Events tab, where we set up if we would like to trigger an alarm, when and if we would like to log the event according to a schedule, and we can create a special compound event. So as you'll see, for each of the available events that we have in our system, will have the same similar type of layout, where the first option would always be trigger alarm, and then you have to define a schedule. Or if this schedule is set to never, then you will simply never have an alarm, so we can also not move on to the alarm-based configuration. So first we have to have a schedule selected here, either based on the schedules we have created earlier, or I can set it that this type of event should always trigger an alarm. So I have the choice between always or using one of my configured schedules. The same applies to when this message will be logged. So I can have an alarm triggered without the actual event being logged inside the logbook. But this is a decision that has to be made by yourself of what the preferred way of displaying this is. And then, as I mentioned, for each single event, as we have just seen how you set it up, we also have the ability to create a compound event. And what this is that it's a combination of several events all becoming true at the same time. And that what I can do is I can add up to 10 devices in one particular compound event. So I could say if I have 2 or 3 single events on their own, I have a specific scenario in place to deal with that. But if all 3 of these events occur at the same time, I can mark it as a more of a higher priority related event, in which it can define to me that all 3 of these conditions have been met, which puts us on a higher notification state of knowing the importance of the particular event that has just come in. So if we have set up our event and it's basically making it available in a schedule, we can move on to actually setting up our alarm. And this is then where we set up the specific actions to be taken when an event is triggering an alarm into the system. And some of the things that an alarm can display would be live video, playback video, an action plan, or a web page, or even a site map that we have made available in the system before. So if we look into how we do this, we first have to define some global alarm settings. So these are settings that will apply to every alarm and how it's handled across the system entirely. So this is something we do prior to setting up alarms individually, because these can have an effect on how we can set up our alarm. Now you'll see that the first one is the maximum amount of image panes per alarm. What this means is I could normally say in this particular configuration where I have a maximum image panes of 5 per alarm, that if a certain alarm comes into the system, that I can have on my within this alarm a selection of 5 different image panes, and this could be 5 live cameras. It could be a mixture of live and playback of some other cameras, or even the displaying of some additional resources such as a map or a document, etc., to be connected to the alarm itself. We have also an auto clear time. If I am configuring an alarm, and we will see this later, I can determine, or I can say that if this alarm is not handled manually, I would like to designate this to be available as automatically cleared. And here we have to define the time in which this will be automatically cleared. So if I mark an alarm as being available to be automatically cleared, it will be done after 30 seconds if in between that time I do not touch it manually. Then the second tab that we have relates to our analog monitor groups. If an alarm comes in that needs to display video on an analog monitor group, I can determine what the display order is if my alarms come in with the same priority. So I can say that a newer alarm should always take priority over an older alarm and be displayed before them. Or I can say that the oldest alarm should always be done first, and once that has been cleared, I will go into the newer alarms that I have coming into my system. And a second option there is that if I am using a particular monitor to display alarm-related video on, if there's currently nothing being used there, I can say, okay, I would like to see a blank screen and wait until the next alarm scenario triggers a camera to be displayed on my monitor group, or for the duration of time when there is no monitor used in the alarm row, I can continue to perform the live display of video. And these are the global settings that we can set up. So then we start moving into the individual configuration of an alarm. And you see that the list of options that we have is basically the same for an event or an alarm, because each event ties to an identical named alarm. And if, like the example we have at the bottom, if for the particular alarm that I'm trying to configure, this is not visible, then I know already that I have forgotten to set up my event, because if I've set up my event to take place either always or on a schedule, this information here in the alarm section will automatically become available. And if we dive into this in detail, we'll first see that the device, that is a name actually where I designated into the system, so I don't have the ability to change anything there. Then the second one is the priority, and the higher the priority, the more important I would consider the alarm. And in this case, to keep in mind that the highest priority we can have in the system is 1, and the lowest priority is 99. Now in the third window we have a title, and that is how the alarm will be coming into the operator client application and the name it's given to it. So this is actually the field, and I can expand it to see the full text that is listed there. That is actually why I can change the title of how the particular alarm comes into my client. The fourth option we have is to select a color for the alarm coming in. So in the client, you'll see that normally by default they're listed as white, but you can for yourself create a separation by color by saying any motion related event I will mark as red, any relay triggered event I will mark as yellow, and any input triggered event or alarm I will mark as green. So this is with a quick glance at the alarms coming into the system, I can already identify quickly the type of alarm that it is. Now if you see here, then on the right side we have the alarm image panes, and this is where in the global alarm setting the maximum number of 5 comes from. If I lower this value to, let's say, 3, then of course in this window here I will never see alarm image panes 4 and 5. If I click per pane number, the little icon that is mentioned in the field below it, it will bring up a pop-up window to determine to me what is the content of this image pane that I would like to use. And then I will have a link to my logical tree, so I can only select devices that have been added into my logical tree, and I can select, for example, a camera and determine, do I want to see this camera in live or in instant playback? And if I selected an instant playback, I have the option to either automatically have the playback run or have it come up in a paused state. Now if I have set alarm-based recording, so if I have assigned an alarm-based recording profile to a camera, I do need to define it here, where you'll see that in the alarm options, I can set it up when it's displayed to also record this camera at that time. So this is the connection that is made to the recording profile for a camera being displayed on an alarm image pane to also be recorded at the same time. And I can set this up for each of the individual alarm image panes that I have made available for my system, and define it up to my specifications. Then finally we have an audio file, and this would be coming more into play when it comes to the Divar IP 7000, because that actually has a sound card in it as opposed to the 3000, but you can set it up in such a way that when a particular event or an alarm comes in, that I also have an audio file being sounded on the machine itself to help me identify, without having a visual look immediately at the application already, that a particular alarm has been triggered and has now been placed in the alarm list. I can use any of the three pre-configured sounds, or I can actually import and manage my own sound file, with the exception that it can only be on the WAV or .mp3 format. And with the preview window on the right hand side, I can test if my audio has been successfully imported and how it would sound once an alarm comes into the client. Now in our final section we have the More Alarm Options, and by clicking this a pop-up window will come up, and at this moment we will focus on 3 tabs here. The first is here that you will see a camera that we have in our system. So this is also another location where I can designate a camera that has been assigned an alarm recording profile to record when this alarm is occurring. But with the exception here is that I am not making this one available to be displayed on an alarm image pane, yet I still would like to make it available to record as soon as this alarm comes in. And when I have selected the recording option here, right next to it, it will unlock the ability to protect this recording. Now if I select this protection of recording, under no circumstances will this video be removed from my storage. Do keep in mind that if you start protecting this with everything, it could majorly impact the amount of video you can still record from other cameras, because of course this video will never expire. It will not say, if you say I would like to keep my video for 7 days, it does not apply to a protected recording video. So be very careful with what you designate as being protected. And a third and fourth option of, if this alarm comes in for the particular camera selected, you can either say that it needs to perform a certain auxiliary command, or in case of a PTZ camera, move to a predefined position where it makes it easier to identify, based on the alarm coming in, that the PTZ camera is already focusing on the correct scene, and from that point on I can actually see, okay, what is the other camera from a different angle looking at. Then we move into the workflow. Now as you'll see here, we have marked to show an action plan, and what this means is that if I have a text file made available in my system, I can display this as soon as the alarm comes in or the alarm is accepted by the operator. What this will do is it will bring up the set of instructions that I've included in the text file, which could, for example, be that the person needs to call a duty manager on shift, needs to write it in a manual logbook, and finalize the handling of the alarm itself accordingly. Then we have the option to display a comment box where the operator can write back what he has actually performed, or if he has successfully handled the alarm or the set of course of actions defined in the action plan. And this comment that is entered there will then also be made available inside the logbook itself. So this can be found back by an administrator to verify what has the operator written as a response when this action plan came up. Of course, in the final option there, we have the ability to force the operator to process the workflow. What is the meaning of this here is that if we do not mark this checkbox, the operator has the ability to click away the action plan and the comment box without filling in anything there. If we mark this to force him to process the workflow, he has to finalize the actions defined in the action plan, write a comment in the comment box before he can continue using his operator client again. So this could be a way to ensure that somebody is performing the actions that you would like them to perform based when a certain alarm comes into the system. And the final tab, which is the analog monitor group, this is where we actually define what camera should be displayed live on a monitor group if an alarm comes in, and then we can say what monitor group it should be displayed on, what logical number within this group it should use, and what camera will be displayed there. As soon as we have selected the camera that we would like to have displayed, we can also include on the on-screen display the title of the alarm, the time of the alarm, and the date of the alarm. But these are optional configurations, and you do not have to include these on the on-screen display, but it could make it easier to identify what alarm came in and at what time the alarm came into the system. And this finalizes then our alarm configuration, and then you'll see that in a quick overview, as a summary, basically you can see the end results of what you had configured and can quickly identify some of the specific things that have been set up for this particular alarm without going into the detailed configuration options.
All guests have been unmuted. All guests have been unmuted. All guests have been muted.
And finally, we move into the user groups to define common user attributes, for example, like permissions, privileges, preset priorities. And what we do here is we configure it on a user group level, and any user that is added into this group automatically inherits all the attributes that have been set up in this user group. So if we look at a default user group that we always have is the admin group with the administrator user, and you'll see on the right hand side that the options there are grayed out. That means that the rights and permissions of an administrator group can never be changed, because this group should always have all rights to be able to perform any tasks related to the system, and it shouldn't be that by accident you revoke some access and could actually potentially lock yourself out from the system. So the exception here is that the admin group cannot have any of its specific changed. We have some shortcut icons in helping you to create these various settings. The first one being a group with a plus is to create a user group. Then we have one icon with a plus is to create a user within a user group. So you first highlight the user group where you would like to create a user from, and then click this icon. And finally, we have two special ones being dual authorization groups, where we would define two user groups, and members of these user groups are then combined into a dual authorization groups. And within that, we can create a log-on pair. So we can have a user of group 1 and a user of group 2, always requiring to authenticate themselves when logging into the client at the same time. So this way, you could say that I have the team manager and one of his operators always have to log on together to allow access into the operator client. Finally, when we look at some specifics that relate to the user groups, is that if we have configured one user group already, and we would like to, for most parts of the rights of that user group, I would like to make those available to other user groups as well. And I can simply define the different tabs from within the user group configuration and copy these over into a different user group, eliminating the need to have to go through a double configuration of all user groups for the same features. So if we look into the user group configuration itself, I can give a description to the user group and what the language is that the operator client starts up with as soon as a user or a member from this particular group logs into the system. Now, again, as same with the configuration client, the default system language is the default language that the client will boot up in, but you can say that for a specific group of users, they will always receive a pre-configured language, so it will always start up whenever they log on in that particular language, regardless of what the system language is. And below that we have a logon schedule in which we determine when is this particular user group allowed to log into the system. And this is where I can then define a schedule that I have created, be it a recording schedule or a task schedule. But I could say that if I know this user of this group is only supposed to be logging in during the day, I can select the day schedule, and if he attempts to log in out of a time period of this particular schedule, he is then refused access into the client. Then we move on to the operator features, and here I can define the various permissions of features of what an operator can do. So I could say for this whole group that they're not allowed to use PTZ control, or that they're not allowed to view any kind of alarms or even playback. Just review the options, and whatever you deem that needs to be applied for a particular user group can be enabled or disabled here. Then we move on to the priorities, and this is the automatic pop-up behavior when it comes to alarms. As you've seen, we've seen previously that we can define a priority to an alarm. If the priority of the alarm is equal or higher to the priority that is defined from within the user group, as soon as this alarm comes in, it will be automatically popping up in an alarm window on the operator client. So this is not even done by a selection, but it's the priority here is the key. So if I would have an alarm with a priority of 9, I would see that if this particular user is logged in, it would automatically pop up on the screen. If I define a priority of 11, it would not. So it's important to keep in mind what do you want from a particular user group in combination with an alarm. When should these be popping up automatically or not in the application? Now then we start looking into the device permissions based on our logical tree, and here we can allow and restrict complete access to folders or individual devices inside our system. So if I have, for example, as I mentioned earlier, our restricted cameras folder here, then I can remove access for a complete folder of cameras for any user that is part of this user group, as well as within a folder define one particular camera that should not be visible. So it comes very specifically to, do I want to remove an entire folder access or just to one particular device? The same I can do when it comes to events and alarms. If I remove the ability from this menu, for example, for encoders and decoders, then any member of this user group will not see any alarm or event related actions into his operator client that have been configured under this particular submenu. So this is also another way where I can define users from not seeing certain higher priority alarms that I would only like to be handled by a specific group of operators. Then we have the control priorities. And this comes into play when I have several people with the option to acquire the control of a pen-tilt zoom camera. Basically what the priority defines here is that the higher the priority, the control will be granted to the person attempting to take the control of the pen-tilt zoom camera who has the highest priority. So if in this example the user with a priority of 50 is controlling a camera, but an administrator with the priority of 1 takes over control of this camera, then the user with the lower priority will be locked out of controlling this camera, and the control will actually be given to the user with the highest priority. If he does not release control of the camera by himself, then you would say at the bottom here you have a timeout for explicit PTZ blocking, that if after 1 minute time he has not released control, that's when the camera will be automatically released again, and any user in the system can take control of this particular pen-tilt zoom camera again. And finally, we have the camera and decoder permissions, where rather than saying I'm going to remove complete access to one camera, I can restrict a user from getting into specific functions of a camera. So I could say, instead of having to disable the entire ability to play back video for all cameras in the system, I can say that a particular user group is not allowed to perform playback of individual devices, as well as the remaining other options that are there. So I can take it a step further and go actually into setting this up per device rather than a system-wide function. And another is the last one is the decoder permissions, where I have to give a user group access to decoders, so to be able to control and place cameras on them. By default, these will be disabled, so keep in mind, if you're creating a new user group and you have a decoder in your system, that if you want to grant them control, you need to manually allow them to do so here. And this is the final configuration option in the user group. And after this setting, you could say, if you've finalized everything, you could move into saving and activating your configuration, and actually then start working with the application. And this is where our current training module ends. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and make any questions that you might have had, make sure that you place them in the Q&A section, and they will be answered. For the next session, the advanced session, we will be announcing the date shortly, and the only thing I would like to ask from you right now is to please complete the poll that I'm going to be sharing with you, and from there on we can use that as feedback for our next sessions. Thank you very much.